Clare. The lineup over the course of the whole conference is really thought-provoking, and today's no different. There are some really great speakers coming up right after me. I was reflecting last night on this opening and violence reduction that I'm really privileged to take part in, and given that my job is to be a director of a violence reduction unit, and I lead one that has deliberately, consciously made sport a key system that we work with to deliver interventions to prevent violence. And given that here in the West Midlands, we hold a national portfolio for sports as a violence reduction intervention amongst the network of 18 VIUs around the country, you'd think that I'd feel quite comfortable with this conversation. But in actual fact, I don't think I do. So do bear with me. And part of the reason that I maybe don't is because I was not very good at sports at school, and I am still waiting for that PE teacher who was a bit of a caricature from the Roald Dahl story to pop up and to reveal to everyone that fact. So I might as well lay that on the table to begin with. And that got me thinking about how I felt about myself at that secondary school age, that sense of not fitting in, of maybe not being kind of worthy of joining in, of feeling left out, of being left out. But above all, really, of being free and available and accessible when my peers were all really busy after school with their various sports activities. That contributed quite a bit to leaving me personally quite vulnerable at that age. And I'd never really connected those things together before. So this has been quite a thought-provoking preparation for this conference today. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that, because what we're trying to do together now is to use the power of sport, the connectivity, the inclusion, the accessibility, and the positive reinforcement and sense of involvement of being part of something with other people to provide a really huge positive bubble around some of our most vulnerable children at their most vulnerable time, and to create conditions where they go on to live, and that in some of our communities is not taken for granted. We want them not just to survive, but to thrive and to go on and to be great citizens of the world. And you, as sports professionals and sports providers, you have that superpower, so use it well. But you weren't in my childhood, and quite a lot of cultural norms and safeguarding norms are very different then, and we've come a long way in the last 25 years, but unfortunately from a low baseline position. And I'm quite open about my experiences as a survivor of child sexual exploitation, and all of the very frightening experiences that involved. And I just want to speak about this really briefly, because I want to get across to people that the harm from exploitation, and I believe this crosses over with the experiences of survivors of youth violence and criminal exploitation too. The harm comes not just from the really appalling acts that are done to you, but also from all the positive experiences and growth and the foundations that you set down for a healthy life and good life outcomes in that remarkable period of adolescence. That all gets stolen from you too. Or at least massively impaired indirectly. You're absent from things, you're unable to participate, you haven't maybe got the energy or the time to be a teenager because you're constantly on edge and dealing with adult complexity that you've been catapulted into. And you're making safety choices that get you by, but they might not be in your long-term best interests. And an example I can give of that is that, I was a grade A student through the first years of secondary school, but had quite a serious injury that put me on crutches for about a year. And I think that's the point where I diverted from spending my free time with my peers and became quite isolated from people my own age group. And by then, I was already in the hands then of the first person that groomed and seriously harmed me, and actually met them through an outdoor pursuit space. So it's that desire to join in and to be a part of something and to have some positive experiences that whole desire was what was exploited in the first place in my case. But the point to make is that, I started to truant quite extensively because it was not safe for me to be in a predictable place on the way home or the way to school. And I would arrive late and leave early. And sometimes I just couldn't hide, what had happened to me, either physically or emotionally. And so because concealment is so important at this point in the harm that's being done to you, I had to kind of hide my whole self really from the world instead, and not be anywhere where it'd be found out. So you can see that, your school grades, your mental health, your physical health, your sexual health, your relationships with parents, with peers, they all get damaged through this toxic experience. And you know how important all of these things are. So you can see that one kind of harm, it layers disadvantage on disadvantage just from that maybe one small story. And this isn't the life that we want for any of our children. And yet violence and exploitation happens far too frequently for us to tolerate. And the changes we need to bring about are really huge, system-wide, civil society-wide, if we're to end this. And I just don't believe that any of us think it's okay that our children here in the UK, one of the most developed countries in the world, are growing up knowing the sound of gunfire in their own streets, knowing friends and family or friends of friends who've died brutally in their own community, making safety plans that involve carrying weapons, getting involved in criminal activity that includes having drugs and other objects inserted inside their young bodies. They're being harmed and exploited at a rate that the data tells us is huge. So the change that we need to bring about here is large scale. It's of a scale and an urgency that I'd say makes this an emergency, a really drawn out intergenerational emergency that we need to come together to tackle. And this is where the violence reduction units and the public health approach to violence come in. And we've all learned a lot about public health this last year. Perhaps that makes it easier to discuss what this approach is. I'm not sure. What it means to us is that we're looking at how violence occurs within our community, how it transmits between communities, how some people have pre-existing social conditions like levels of deprivation in the area they live or go to school, for example, that make them more vulnerable to either becoming a victim or to becoming an offender in relation to violence. And there are factors that make this riskier for a person on an individual level, maybe substance abuse in the home or speech, language and communication challenges, the absence of trusted adults. And there are also things that make it less risky, so protective factors too. And one of those is engagement and connectivity with their community. And if we can get a sense at a high level of geography, a population level, say for the West Midlands or for a city, of the balance of risk and protection in our area, then we can do some things and we can deploy some interventions to change the balance in favour of more protective factors and thus to be preventative ahead of the chance for that chain of events to really begin. And a lot of our very early preventative work is building on what the evidence tells us about the early years intervention period and about how working with 2, 3, 4-year-olds right back to gestational periods, we can affect the circumstances in which those children are growing up, and then we can affect their life chances of getting involved in serious violence. Very sci-fi, maybe, very common sense if we recognise that poverty and deprivation is one of the biggest risk factors, and all the pressures of growing up in poverty and the multiple ways that opens up some less than healthy choices and closes down other doors for you. Another thing about the public health approach is this concept of needing to know what works, of believing that the kids we're deploying interventions to help, that they deserve interventions that we've tested and we know have a good chance of success. This is, after all, a matter of life and death for them. So we need more than good ideas and good intent in our toolkit. We need to draw on science and evaluation and test approaches to learn if they make a difference and in what circumstances that applies. So one of the things that the VIU does is support evaluation, and we work with a number of universities to try and understand impact, and with our sports providers to get better at recording the kind of data that helps us to do that. So we need to get comfortable and put practical steps in place to test interventions to improve them. And then when they can be demonstrated to work, we need to move behind them as a society and make it business as usual. It just becomes a new way of doing things, because the scale of the problem I mentioned a few minutes ago, that calls for widespread change. And one way that we bring about widespread change is through systems leadership, really, through bringing together whole parts of our ecosystem and encouraging it to align behind a long-term vision of violence reduction that is evidence-based. That's a relatively easy sentence to say and a really hard thing to do, and it doesn't occur naturally in many places. So the VIUs were set up in the 18 parts of the country where the levels of violence against young people were highest. We were given a government mandate to work across systems. So we are multi-agency units that have people from backgrounds like education, from people referral units, from sports professionals, from youth workers, policy makers in local, regional and national government, criminal justice, health workers, police. We're working all together to create the conditions where it's more likely violence will end. It might be by developing toolkits, guidance, good practice, by promoting the same, or by promoting collaboration rather than siloed working and commissioning, by maybe being a critical friend and holding a mirror up to local practice and supporting and challenging it to improve. In the West Midlands, one of the systems we've focused on is the sports system, and we've done some great work and we'd be happy to share, but realise we have a lot more to do too. One example is in our capacity building campaign last year, which basically saw us looking at the skills and capacity gaps in our sports provider network. You know, they were great at sports, great at being sports coaches, but we wanted them to be equipped to be the very best person to come alongside a young person at a vulnerable time. And we wanted to make sure that a higher proportion of the very vulnerable young people we were working with were the people that were finding their way into those sports provisions. And we realised that loaded real responsibility onto our sports providers. So we mapped the referral system, connected providers into local safeguarding structures. We upskilled them in recognising different forms of exploitation, in understanding the local risk profile, translated some of their local knowledge back into the police force and law enforcement, and generally tried to equip them to work alongside kids who are trying to exit a really difficult and unsafe situation. And we worked hard also to make data available that highlighted the riskiest cohorts and used that to plan where to invest. And given that, you know, the power of mentoring and that reachable moment within sporting activity, you know, that's a given. But I think it was this wiring behind the scenes that was really a game changer for us in terms of sport as a violence reduction intervention. Another concept is perhaps described as we never stop giving people chances to exit the off-ramp of being involved in violence and take responsibility for their actions. We present again and again and again in that reachable moment. Being that through placing youth workers in A&E units, in mental health services, in police custody, in prison. You know, we believe it is possible for people to change, and that taking action to prevent further harm being done is absolutely key, no matter what's happened up until that point. And that brings me to the final point about the public health approach, you know, the thing that wraps around all of our activity, and that's the sense that change in these campaigns of activity are community-led. That this is not a thing that's done by the statutory agencies to the community, but is driven through consultation and engagement, and also by real community ownership and credibility, and is therefore naturally self-sustaining. And that means the concept of doorstep sport is a really natural fit for us. In the West Mids, we've tried, and it has been challenging due to the pandemic, but we've tried to shift the centre of gravity to our local priority places. We've trialled and are extending place-based pilots that coordinate at a really hyper-local level violence reduction initiatives and interventions, with the ambition that these are driven by the people who work, live and go to school in an area. And one way that those networks are informed is through the youth voice that our sports providers are able to gather on our behalf. So a whistle-stop tour there of the VIUs and the public health approach. If it sparks some interest and you'd like to know more, we'd love to hear from you. For those connected to the West Mids, we're at viu@westmidlands.police.uk. If you're further afield, we can try to connect you with your local public health and policing lead. I'm unable to stay for the questions, but you get an upgrade really, because my colleague Aaron Northmore's on the call and can step in. And just then in closing, just wanted to pay some testament to our relationship with StreetGames and with Aaron specifically. Aaron was seconded to the VIU from StreetGames, and we're really proud that we've had the first violence reduction sports specialist in the country here in our VIU. And Aaron, you've delivered really admirably in that role. We lose you imminently to promotion in StreetGames, and we're really in recognition of the scale of our ambition, we've replaced with 2 new colleagues we're in the process of welcoming into the VIU family. So just to put on our record, our thanks to Aaron for his leadership and endeavours that have really transformed the way that we work. We really value the partnership with StreetGames and the ability this gives us to harness the energy and momentum of community sport. And of course, we're a strategic body, so the main way we affect change is through others. So my thanks really must also go to any of the providers who have worked with us on the call. The impact you have, and directly and indirectly, to children and young people in this most challenging of years is really significant, is noticed, and is making a huge difference. And for all your efforts, particularly over the pandemic period, you have my enduring thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Claire, for those opening remarks and some real powerful messages there. The sharing, thank you so much for that. The real focus on causes and experiences that young people face, and that line that Claire gave us there about never stopping giving chances, never giving up, and that's such a powerful message to hear from somebody who is really, really driving that whole wide systems approach to violence reduction right across the West Midlands and across the country. Thank you indeed. With that in mind, I'm now delighted to welcome somebody whose work StreetGames has looked at and admired for a significant amount of time, and somebody who's been working very, very closely around the whole development of this concept of pro-social identity and how pro-social identity really supports a young person's journey from perhaps an offending behaviour patterns into not offending and not reoffending. And so to give his thoughts and help us as a collective this morning on this conference really understand the importance of pro-social identity, can I please welcome Professor Neal Hazel, Professor of Criminal Justice and Criminology at the University of Salford. Good morning, Neal.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk with such a fantastic group of speakers as well. I've put my Twitter handle, I don't know if they say handle, do they? Is that it's a bit CB radio, isn't it? I've put my Twitter handle on there. If you could follow me, that's great, because I'm still trying to persuade my wife that I'm popular. So if you could do that, that would be brilliant. So yeah, thanks, Graham. We're going to have a look at the concept, the idea of pro-social identity. And actually, for me, pro-social identity, the whole idea of it in my research came from a really low point in my career in about 2014. And this is me sitting in a hotel room somewhere in Kent, being really depressed. And actually, I'm on an inspection with the probation inspectorate and looking at kids, support for kids coming out of custody and when they're out of custody. And I'd spent pretty much all of my career looking at what factors seem to help reduce the risk of reoffending and help kids when they come out of custody. Those were the terms we used in those days. And we had all these statistical factors that we saw that were associated, and we'd fed them into policy and practice. Oh, I can see somebody's just joined me. Great. And we found, you know, we put together a guidebook of all these factors and for practitioners to follow. And going on that inspection, we realized it just was not working at all. Practitioners were kind of not following the practice that we'd put down as academics, and you know, we thought our job was done, and it clearly wasn't. You know, it just wasn't happening. The practice and the outcomes for kids and the support for kids was described by the chief inspector as shocking. And so the rest of my career since then, sort of the last 6-7 years or so, has been to try and work out why is it so bad, even though we kind of know these statistical things that made a difference. And of course, the answer really then was to in this research project called Beyond Youth Custody that we worked on, was to go back to basics and actually go back to people's lives and forget the statistics for a while and actually go in and speak to kids and children and look at our, you know, all our in-depth interviews we've done and to try and work out what's going on there. Why is it so poor? And when it works for people, why does it work? Why does support work? Not just in resettlement, but generally in youth justice and beyond. When support works for kids, why does it work? It says young people in here rather than children a lot of the time, because we were looking at from 10 to 25 years old. And what we found was things were so poor because practitioners were jumping straight away for the structural factors, the kind of the real emergency factors, and just kind of going from, like, you know, he hasn't got accommodation, stick him in some accommodation, or she hasn't got education, right, let's find some education, without necessarily thinking what was right for that child, for that young person, what was really correct for them and for their journey forward. So and we realized what was happening is that's not for want of practitioners working really hard and wanting the best for their kids. Of course they did, but what was happening is that they weren't quite working out why that accommodation would make a difference long term to reducing offending for the child, or why getting them education would make a difference, or why putting them into sport would make a difference. They kind of knew it would, but it wasn't necessarily the right sport or the right accommodation or whatever for that child. So the child didn't engage with it, they didn't move forward. And the reason why it wasn't necessarily the right one is because the practitioners involved lacked a theory of change. They lacked the understanding or even sort of, they lacked an understanding of why that would make a difference. What would drive that change? What would drive that improvement? And therefore, how did their intervention or their engagement with the child fit into the bigger picture? So we looked in detail to try and work out what was the theory of change, what happened for a child when it worked. when they went through and they had a sort of constructive future. First of all, we realised that resettlement, which is what we'd looked at, the sort of the period coming out of custody, wasn't just a transition. Actually, you had to look at the child's personal journey, a long journey. It's not a sentence journey, and it's not a linear journey like this, but it is a journey that a child takes, a very personal a personal journey that they take. Less like Monopoly maybe, and more like snakes and ladders. Of course, you can take sort of 1 step forward and 2 back, or 2 forward and 1 step back, and that's almost like, that's a child's development or a child's journey, particularly when there are challenges in that child's life. But what happens when it kind of goes well? Well, this is what we found. We essentially found that when services and resettlement and youth justice services generally were effective for children, it's when there is a process that happens with that child that enables a shift in their identity that moves them away from crime towards a positive future. A shift in their identity. And that was the heart of it. That was the crux. That's the theory of change. So what do we mean by identity? Okay, essentially, we mean the way we see ourselves and our place in the world. That's it. And that is the absolute central concept, because that's what we found makes the difference. That makes the difference for children, and whether those children go on to misbehave or behave. And so why is identity so important? And there was an example actually when I was playing golf a couple of years ago, and I was walking down the 9th fairway with a guy called Mick, and we were talking about a couple of golfers who had had a fight because one had spilled some beer on the other by pushing his beer against him because he was unhappy with something he'd done, and the guy who had beer spilt on him punched the other guy. And Mick said to me, "Oh, well, you'd have done the same thing, wouldn't you, Neil?" And I thought, actually, no, I wouldn't have done the same thing. I wouldn't have punched him. I had a bit of a masculinity crisis then. I was like, was that because I'm a coward? Is it because I'm kind of less of a man? Or what? And then I thought, well, actually, no, I wouldn't, because that's not what Neal does. Neal wouldn't do that. And actually, that's pretty much what happens with all of us. In any situation, any given situation, we've got an idea of who we are and the sort of person we are, and our roles and our characteristics from what people have told us and from what we've discovered over the years. And we draw on that when we are deciding and when we're thinking about any particular situation we're in. So I know I wouldn't hit that person because that's not who Neal is. And when you actually interview and speak to kids, you find very much the same kind of language when they talk about this sort of change or a shift that they've happened, or development in their pro-social identity. They don't necessarily talk about what they do, they talk about who they are. I am the sort of person, I am this, I just need to do me. Very similar concept to kind of the idea of in a gap year, students go and find themselves, we travel to India to find themselves. It is that, if you think of maturing or a maturity process as a process of finding your place in the world, particularly if you may have had a place as a child, but finding it as an adult. So that's the key process. So what we found then is that's the theory of change. When a child or a young person has this sort of pro-offending identity, or an identity that is conducive to offending, and takes that journey or makes that shift or has that development to a pro-social identity, or an identity that allows them the sort of constructive behavior and constructive working. It's actually a theory that's existed in adult literature for some time, desistance theory, or called secondary desistance, but we didn't know it existed. We hadn't seen it, and it hadn't explained the way things were with children before. And actually, we weren't looking for it, but that's what we found made the difference. We now say pro-social development rather than a shift, because we don't want to assume that a child has a pro-offending identity per se, and I'll go on to talk about that a little bit more later. So what are the building blocks of identity or pro-social identity? Well, we've divided it into activities, interactions, and roles. So activities, sport, street games, for instance, that works not just because, you know, it fills a child's time or it gives them an interest, but because what happens is, you know, when they do that, they're not just playing football or whatever. They're actually, you know, start to think of themselves as team players, start to think of themselves as leaders, start to think of themselves in different ways about their identity. Interactions, of course, perhaps the most obvious one, but you know, the things that people tell us about ourselves can really underline a positive identity or undermine that. And then roles we take on, they may be formal roles, like, you know, a professor, I'm acting a certain way now, a little bit bumbling because, you know, that's my identity. Or they may be informal roles, like I'm the person in the family who sorts out the IT, for instance, or I'm the, you know, I'm the clever one, or I'm the whatever that may be. So activities, interactions, and roles, which is, you know, not handy acronym for AIR. And generally, what you find is that we want to help children to get that sort of fresh air. So if shifting identity is what makes the difference, what's the role of all agencies? Well, essentially, the role of all agencies must be to support that pro-social identity development if you want to make a difference, or help provide children with that fresh air. Of course, you can see that's what street games would do in relation to activities, but also interactions as well. So, hello. We've developed this idea into a framework called constructive working or constructive resettlement, as it's been adapted and developed by the Youth Justice Board, and you'll hear from Keith in a moment. And there's three parts to this framework of constructive working. The first is constructive casework, which is when you have a case or when you're working with a child directly, don't just go to the structural stuff. You've got to have that individualized personal support, which is about guiding their development, guiding their identity development, the way they think about themselves. And that involves asking some questions about their identity and about what elements of it may allow offending if they're already if they are offending, or not, but essentially looking at their strengths and their interests and goals that can inform their identity going forward. And then thinking about what pro-social identity the child can develop, what interests them, where do they see themselves going, who do they see themselves being, and then looking at the roots to that pro-social identity and basing the structural support on those roots. The second element of the framework is what we call the 5 C's, or the characteristics that we found are associated with developing pro-social identity support. Has to be constructive, has to be focused on this identity shift, has to be focused on motivating, and has to be future oriented for the child. Co-created, because, you know, it's their identity, so you have to do it with the child. You can't give a child an identity or a pro-social identity. Every identity and every route, every journey is different, so it has to be customized. But it has to be consistent from different agencies and those working, because if you've got some undermining and some underlining a particular identity or a different identity, it's not going to work. It's going to be confusing for the child. And therefore, really, it has to be coordinated, ideally, or at least working together with different agencies to ensure that it's consistent. The messages that are consistent. Messages is the key theme for the third of the elements in the constructive working framework, which is about identity awareness. You have to be aware of the messages that the child is giving you about their identity. It may be something as simple as a football shirt that they're wearing. You know, do they feel associated with that club? But you know, it could be other things about their identity with their family, and what things are they saying? What language are they using? Is it identity with their ethnicity, for instance, or other elements of diversity? And this is why diversity is so absolutely crucial, because it's so important to identity. But secondly, what messages are you giving the child about their identity? Are you underlining or undermining positive identity development? Can you help reinforce the way that they think of themselves in a positive or a pro-social way? So you need to look at things through an identity lens. What messages do adults give children about their their identity. It's crucial, of course, right from a young age. You can see, you know, children take note of things that people say to them about themselves. Do they say they're a cheeky little monster? Do they say that they're a devil, or do they say that they're angel? Do you say you're a clever girl, or that you're a good boy? You know, it's not rocket science, but these things matter, and you can see how they would make a difference to a child's journey longer term. But again, we don't want to assume that a child has a pro-offending identity. There's also an element that we've now discovered called pro-social identity disruption, where a child goes through a transition, for instance, like they go into care, and key interactions that have built a pro-social identity get disrupted. And children are going through transitions all the time, so there is a danger of that. So that consistency over time, and consistency of sort of their hobbies and their and their leisure activities, if they span transitions, that can be really useful as well. So those are the three elements of the constructive working framework. But I did want to draw on, just really as a segue into Keith's talk in a moment, when he's going to talk in more detail about child first. But one of the key pillars of child first, this second one, is this theory of change, which is not just a theory, it's based on research, but you know, that the way we help children move forward in a child first way is to develop their pro-social identity. So this has been adopted and really driven forward by the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales, as well as lots of others working with us, like the Youth Custody Service and others. So really, there's a lot of momentum now. We've discovered that this is really what makes the difference. And of course, then everybody needs to review our practice through this identity lens, and to think how we can really underline pro-social identity development and avoid undermining that, and really thinking in that way. We have produced some work which is available if you just Google using an identity lens or you know, my name, then you'll find that. I can't say it's available in all good bookshops because it's not, but it is available free on the internet. But I want to end with the words from a young person who, when actually working at the Youth Justice Board, I asked one of our young ambassadors, you know, what would have made a difference to you growing up? What would have helped you give up offending sooner? And he said, well, if people had focused less about what I've done and more about what I can become. And that really more about what I can become, or who I can become, even, is really the essence of that future focused pro-social identity development. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Professor Neal Hazel there from the University of Salford. Take a look at Neal, connect with Neal on Twitter. I know he's really keen for that. Look at the work, it's fabulous. And Neal, we're grateful for the work that you did in supporting street games around the consultation of our specific theory of change about the contribution that sport makes, and how we really want to keep that narrative going, so that we're really aligned in the thinking that we're doing about the role that community sport can play. And absolutely, we want to be one of those agencies that works collaboratively to really drive pro-social identity. Thanks so much. So Neal's teed this up really nicely now, but now we're going to welcome Keith Fraser, Chair of the Youth Justice Board of England and Wales, to share some thoughts now about how taking a child-first approach and a focus on strengths and a focus on a pro-social identity really starts to play out now through the way Youth Justice delivers work with young people up and down the country. Good morning, Keith. Welcome.
Good morning. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'll do apologies to Stuart straight off in relation to this, because Stuart might have heard a lot of what I'm going to say already, but there are some slight changes I've adapted for today, obviously. Really pleased to follow the two speakers, really, because they're kind of setting us on a journey. We've got people who are in key roles, you know, some who've had lived experience, and with that lived experience, use that lived experience to support themselves, to support their thinking, and also what they do in relation to their professional outlook. And then we've got Neal Hazel, who's really understands the theory and is putting that theory into practice around children and what's right for children in this space. So just a little bit about me before I go on and kind of talk about the reasons why I'm here. Keith Fraser, I joined the Youth Justice Board back in January 2018 and became, as a board member, and then became chair in April of last year. I joined it after a long career in policing and worked my way through various positions up to becoming a senior police officer. I worked in the Metropolitan Police Service in London and also in the West Midlands. I've also chaired a youth offending team management board, led significant sport and physical activity programmes in the West Midlands, strategically for the Prince's Trust across the West Midlands. So I've been directly and indirectly being involved with children through my work in criminal justice over the last 30 years or so. The Youth Justice Board, as you're probably aware, has oversight of the entire youth justice system. We provide independent, evidence-based advice and leadership to drive improvements that increase children's positive outcomes and prevent offending. Being an advocate for children in our system, and especially those who are vulnerable, is incredibly important to me. And also now moving on to Child First, which you've heard so much about before. At the Youth Justice Board, we talk about the need for a child first approach within youth justice. Children are at the heart of what we do, and our focus is on better outcomes for children. As an evidence-based driven organisation, we believe Child First is about what works, and I'll underline what works, in preventing offending by children. It supports fewer victims and safer communities, and it's not a mantra or ideology. The youth justice system has been hugely successful at reducing the number of children entering the system and the children within the secure estate. However, those children who remain in the system face far more complex challenges and need us to reconsider the support available to them to move forward with their lives. The evidence tells us that support should take a child first approach. It is our assessment that it is this approach which will be effective in addressing the offending behaviour of the small number of children within the justice system today, and in preventing offending by those children who are more likely to enter the system. Our vision calls for a systemic response to meet this challenge, where the Youth Justice Board and all justice services are operating in accordance with a child first approach. I'd also add that this ask and this drive is not just around those directly involved with the Youth Justice services and system, but also those agencies and departments that are connected with it, because we know that the things that happen to children before they come into the criminal justice service have an impact on their journey in their lives, as Neal has said earlier on. In relation to a child first approach, there are four key principles or four key pillars, and that's about prioritising the best interests of children, recognising their particular needs, capacities, rights and potential. 2, promotes children's individual strengths and capacities. 3, encourages children's active participation, engagement and wider social inclusion. And finally, 4, promotes a childhood removed from a justice system using preemptive prevention, diversion and minimal intervention. Child First, as I've said earlier on, goes beyond the youth justice system. The principle is one that should steer our interventions with all children, to recognise the potential they bring with them and to instil in them the sense of their own value. This is a similar principle to sport, the potential children have. A child first approach is perhaps even more important than ever in the current climate. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to greater challenges for a lot of children, including mental health, changes to education, and an increase in harms caused by exploitation and abuse. These are all things outside of a child's control, but which can increase the likelihood, but not necessarily, of them being drawn into the justice system. Everyone must take steps to prevent this happening. We are also committed to making sure we influence and improve processes so that all children are treated fairly and equally. We want to see a justice system where children are not disadvantaged because of their ethnic background, learning disability, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic that might attract a different treatment. And quite rightly, we've spoken already around prevention and the importance of prevention and diversion. As adults, we have a moral, and I mean a moral responsibility to protect children in our society from all harms that might prevent their growth and ability to realise their potential. If we fail in this responsibility, children will almost inevitably fail to thrive. In some cases, they'll be drawn towards negative influences and behaviours of self-worth and value. Evidence tells us that there are many benefits to diverting children away from the formal criminal justice system. Diversion contributes to better outcomes for children and consequently reduce crime and safer communities. It is an important tool. Evidence also tells us that contact with the youth justice system alone increases the likelihood of children reoffending and continuing their journey deeper into the justice system. Contact with the justice system can negatively label children in both their own eyes and the eyes of others, and create a particular identity which contributes to an increased likelihood of further offending. If you tell someone that they are bad, it is not unreasonable to think that they may begin to believe this and in turn begin to behave in ways which further reinforce this belief. We at the Youth Justice Board want to break that cycle. We want to make sure that wherever possible, children are prevented from having contact with the youth justice system, and where contact is unavoidable, any interventions should create constructive opportunities for children to realise their potential. There are some groups of children that are overrepresented in the youth justice system, and this remains a concern for us. It's an issue we've highlighted for some time. In our recent strategic assessment, our recent strategic plan and business plans, it is one of our strategic priorities of work, and we continue to focus on that. We continue to work with partners to understand and respond to the challenging issues faced by children, and we're also using our convening power to bring parties together to problem solve and find solutions to removing structural barriers which can create inequalities. One such practical example of that and how the Youth Justice Board is working in partnership with the sporting and physical activity world is a project called Levelling the Playing Field. Here we are working to understand the challenges that are faced by using this project, which is a 3-year groundbreaking initiative delivered by the Alliance of Sport and other partners within the criminal justice system, supported by Street Games and others, which is being evaluated by the University of Birmingham and other academic partners. The project uses the power of sport and physical activity to engage and improve health and life outcomes for more than 11,200 ethnically diverse children who are more likely to enter the system or who are already involved in the criminal justice system. Not only are we looking at the numbers of children that we're going to impact on, but we're also looking at the evidence, and that's really important in what we learn from this project. And so the evaluation and academic part of this is critically important. We know that racial disparity in the criminal justice system is increasing. And we also know that ethnic minority children who are overrepresented in lower socioeconomic groups are significantly less likely to be engaged in physical activities. And I'll just repeat that, significantly less likely to be engaged in physical activities. So despite some of the stereotypes that we might have about minority engagement in sport and physical activity, there is still a lot to be done there. So you can see where the two priorities and strategies of the criminal justice world and the sporting and physical activity world overlap. Levelling the playing field uses a public health approach to raise awareness of adverse childhood experiences, resilience and trauma responsive approaches, which are recognised as a model of best practice and have been used to tackle the causes of violent crime. This initiative also aims to empower local people and organisations to help them maximise their existing frontline work to increase the number of ethnically diverse children taking part in sport and physical activity and prevent and diverse ethnically diverse children from being involved in the criminal justice system. The focus is on reducing harm, reversing harm and preventing harm. Levelling the playing field is operating in 6 cities and towns, 3 London boroughs and up to 8 secure establishments, working with over 75 partners. It's also right the way across the youth estate as an element of importance for prevention and diversion. And we're really excited to see what the outcome of this project is and seeing how it can impact on future developments. There are other examples of good work going on in secure estate and the community. The use of sport in the children's secure estate can also be provided as an access point of support and qualifications to improve life prospects. Some examples, for example, at Wetherby Youth Offending Institution, Leeds Rhino rugby team are providing training sessions, offering life coaching and mentors to support vulnerable children. At Feltham YOI, Saracens Rugby Club offer coaching qualifications. In the community, we have KICS, which is a national programme funded by the Premier League and various police services that uses football to work with children in deprived areas. KICS gets children off the street and playing football. Since the project started, youth crime dropped by 2/3 within 1 mile of Elthorne Park, for example. The Boxing Academy in Tottenham, North London, is a sports-based initiative and an alternative to a pupil referral unit working with children who have struggled in mainstream schools. The academy provides boxing training with other sports and regular lessons such as English and maths. Many of the children who attended have been involved in offending and have been excluded from school. There is also, of course, the valuable work of StreetGames. It's an example of providing activities for children in a familiar location where they may feel more at ease and therefore able to concentrate on the activity itself. By doing that, they feel the benefits, engage in it fully, and hopefully are then inspired. And as Neal Hazel said earlier on, supporting their pro-social development. I'd just like to conclude with a few points. The evidence shows the significant benefits sport brings to outcomes for children in the youth justice system. StreetGames and Levelling the Playing Field websites have case studies of where this is working at a local level. And we know from our engagement with our youth advisory network, there are children that were helped by being involved in sport. It gave them a focus, a purpose, and diversion. We know sports can bring children together, encourage collaborative working and problem solving, and give children a focus and distraction. And we know there are a huge range of sports out there. What works for one child may not work for another, and we should be identifying opportunities for children across all disciplines. We're currently surrounded by international sporting events such as the Commonwealth Games coming up shortly, the Euros, Wimbledon and the Olympics. But it doesn't have to be at a professional level. The great thing about sport is that it can be accessible to everyone and it can be free or at low cost. But children need support and encouragement, especially those with more complex needs. Our view is that the justice system is not just about the full potential, not just about using the full potential of sport, but it's also about a focus of what's needed in a particular area with a strategic lead. We need to recognise the work that is needed to support the sector, which could provide significant benefits, which we feel is underutilised at the moment. We're currently working to that end. The best outcomes for children are the ones where we can prevent children coming into contact with the criminal justice system. Children have huge potential. We want to harness that. We need to give children the opportunities to realise this potential and succeed. It is more important now than ever to support our society to move past the current challenges. We know relationships create positive change for children. Children need adults to believe in them and see their potential. This helps them to see it too. If we allow children to succeed in life, we prevent offending. We will also protect the public and enable our society to thrive. If we see children as children, look out for them and want the very best for them and encourage them to believe in themselves, then we'll be providing a better system for all. I'd like to end by asking you all to join together and make Child First real. Champion diversion and desistance through the excellent vehicle of sport and physical activity. But most importantly, never, and I mean never, write a child off. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Keith. Keith Fraser there, Chair of the Youth Justice Board of England and Wales. And hopefully delegates have seen a really clear synergy around the messages of Child First, the importance of pro-social identity, and coming from both the system piece and the academic piece, the real opportunity that is being presented at the feet of sport to say that there is a strong role for sport to play its role here. And so, to conclude this morning's plenary keynote, can I invite Mark Lawrie, Chief Executive of StreetGames, to share his thoughts on how sport is in the right place to deliver this essential work and make a response and support vulnerable young people up and down the country. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Graham, and thanks very much. I really need to talk to you about putting me on after illustrious speakers like Keith and Neal and Alison, because actually it's such a difficult thing to follow, but I'm going to try. And the first thing I thought I would just talk about, because I've been thinking about some of what the other speakers have said about young people, and I'm a parent. I'm sure many of you are. And last February, on the 3rd of February, I had probably the worst day of my life as a parent, because my 16-year-old, as she was then, daughter was actually arrested while she was at school. And she was taken to our local police station. And I spent 6 hours with her in a cell, preparing for an interview with the police to then see what would happen next. And the reason she was in that cell was because of something actually that Neal said. It was because of her mental health. It was because of the behaviour that she was demonstrating at that time in school, and not for one moment about what she really is and what she can become. And so from my point of view, what I really have learned in a very real way as a parent is that young people's identity shifts over time. My daughter 3 years ago was hugely successfully academically, but got herself into a position for various reasons where she got cut off from her peer group, and the cycle that followed that led to her in a prison cell, and me at the end of the day as a parent in tears, not sure how to deal with it. But actually now, my daughter's at 6th form, something I didn't believe was possible. She's doing her A-levels, something that last year I didn't believe was possible. And part of the reason why that's happened is because she's managed to find a way through being active, through going to the gym. She was never particularly sporty, but she goes to the gym and she cycles with her friends, and that's part of what's got her back to a place where she can believe in herself and see the future that she should have. And makes me also think of when I was a child, and my mum used to read books to me, and one of my favourite books when I was a kid was Aesop's Fables. And I really think that there's a huge parallel here between how sport and criminal justice can work together. Because if you look at a government level, at the amount of money that gets spent on the various aspects of criminal justice, some of which Keith has talked about, like the secure estate, all of the preventative work of violence reduction units and police and crime commissioners, the budget, the size of it is the size of a lion. It's a huge department, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the huge areas. Sport is the mouse. It's tiny in budget terms, but actually, as in Aesop's fable about when the lion was caught by the hunter in a net, it was the mouse that actually played the role in coming and biting through the various bits of the net to help the lion with its problem. And that for me perfectly sums up how sport can play a role. We'll never be the size of the lion, but actually we can be so valuable. And the work that many of you do in your communities at a local level is making a huge, huge difference to the way that community safety and criminal justice are able to make a difference to the lives of young people. And right now is a great opportunity and a great moment. And earlier on, talking about system change, we've got an alignment of different strategies on both sides of the divide, if you like, both sides of the fence. So in sport, we have Sporting Future, the government strategy for an active nation that talks about the importance of social and community development as an outcome, not just for children and young people, but for the whole population. We have the new Sport England strategy that was launched in January, which talks about uniting the movement, connecting communities, making a real local difference in place, positive experiences for children and young people. And you match that up against the child first approach that Keith was just talking about, the policing vision for 2025 and the child-centred policing policy, and all of the energy that you heard from Alison earlier around systems change, preventative long-term visions. And there's a real opportunity for the two sectors to work together to make a difference for young people. And at Street Games, we've been on a journey. We started our work back in 2015, working with 8 police and crime commissioners to develop 10 principles that can help any sports provider to design what they provide in terms of activity in a way that can reduce antisocial behaviour, but also encourage a pro-social identity, as Neal was talking about. We built on that in 2017 with 31 police and crime commissioners through the Police Transformation Fund. And at that point, it was about disseminating that learning that we garnered in the first Home Office programme, advocating for the connections between sport and community safety, designing a process by which young people who were involved or on the fringes of the criminal justice system could be referred into sport settings in local communities where they could get the support they needed to think about that piece that, again, Neal said, to be more about what they could become than what they currently were. And then in the summer of 2019, when the focus of government turned to serious youth violence, we worked with you, local organisations in 45 places across the country, not just to run a 6-week programme, although that's what government reported, but actually to build into what you do every single day of the week, supporting young people in your communities to find a positive path. And although we talked about that as a 6-week programme, we know that it was part of the journey that you are on as organisations with young people. And we've heard already about the great work from Clare in the West Midlands around the violence reduction. work that's happening there. That work is going beyond the West Midlands now. West Midlands were the trailblazer. We're now doing it in Greater Manchester. We're involved in work in Devon and Cornwall. We're working and starting some work in West Yorkshire, in Essex. There's lots of areas now that are seeing the value of sport to the things that they are trying to achieve. And as we move on this journey, all the way through it, we've been supported by our colleagues from Loughborough University, because the one thing that's true of other areas is that just seeing the difference locally and just meeting young people is not enough. What we have to have, and Keith stressed this, is a real understanding of what works. And that research and insight and evidence base that has tracked our journey all the way since 2015 is the thing that's allowing us to make the difference. And it's the thing that's unlocked probably one of the most valuable relationships that we've developed so far, which has been with the Youth Endowment Fund, which many of you will know is an organisation that was established with a £200 million endowment from government, from dormant assets, which is all about changing the lives of young people. So we're on a positive journey. There are many things that we have done as an organisation, working with many of you as partners on this call, but there's an awful lot more to do. In no way are we at the end of the journey. And some of the things that are on the middle of this slide now are important to us. So working with the all-party parliamentary group, which is looking at sport, the role of sport and physical activity in criminal justice, which is being supported by the Alliance for Sport and Criminal Justice. Doing even more work with police and crime commissioners and violence reduction units. The elections of the PCCs happened in May. There are a number of new police and crime commissioners that really need to understand the great work that you all do, that we have all been doing collectively, so that they can include that in their strategies and their plans going forwards. Because at Street Games, we know that what you provide in local communities genuinely changes lives. And it doesn't just change lives, it transforms lives. And it helps make young people healthier, safer, and more successful. Because ultimately, for all of the strategies, for all of the talking, this is what we want to see. We want to see young people with smiles on their faces, feeling confident, feeling like they've got a positive future, interacting with people both within their area, outside their area, because all of this comes through doorstep sport. And doorstep sport and the places that you provide it are absolutely crucial, and never more so than now. After the last 16 months, the chance for young people to come together, to spend positive time with their peers, be that on a games area, in a community centre, on a patch of grass behind the flats, or even by the garages, as you can see from that top photo. It's all about young people feeling they have somewhere positive to go, where people care about their futures. And Clare and Neal both talked about this, perhaps in different ways. I was talking to George, who runs one of our amazing locally trusted organisations in London, and he was telling me how young people have these unique change moments. And it's very hard to predict when that will be. And he told me about a young man that he'd worked with, who he'd worked with for 12 years. And he always felt like there was a bit of a barrier in front of this young person. He didn't feel like he could let his guard down. And then something significant happened in the life of that young person. And just at that moment, he was able to see change. And George was there, as were his team, to support that young person to find a new path. Because there isn't an on-off switch for this. I know that from the journey I've been with my daughter. It isn't like a broken leg. It doesn't get fixed in 6 weeks. You need to stick with young people and be there for them, so that actually when their moment for change comes, you are the people beside them that will make the real difference. And there are enough examples of people who can tell you about how there were people right there for them when they needed them. Anthony Joshua would have been able to talk, and has talked very eloquently, about his life in Watford and how actually before he got into boxing, he was right on the fringes of something far, far more difficult. Raheem Sterling, who hopefully, if you're an England fan, you'll be seeing banging a goal at around 5:30 this evening. But when you look at his early life and the fact that he spent 3 years in a pupil referral unit in North London because of his behaviour, having someone to believe in him has led him all the way to the England side. And those are the people we see on the telly, but actually this is real for us. And this is Jay from Western Bartonshire. And Jay was understood by his local community in Scotland to be someone who would be constantly involved with the police. The moment there was an issue on the estate, the police would be looking for Jay. Jay got involved in an organisation like yours, and Jay is now a qualified social worker working in West Dunbartonshire and making a huge difference to the lives of other young people in his neighbourhood. So my plea is to recognise that nothing in life that's worth anything is easy. You're all here because you want to make a difference to young people. You're all here because together we're ready to create a brighter future for young people. And all of our partners, the Premier League Community Fund, the Alliance for Sport, the EFL Trust, the Youth Endowment Fund, Keith and his colleagues at the Youth Justice Board, colleagues at HITS, we all want the same thing that you all want locally. So thank you for everything you do, and thanks very much, Graham.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to all our opening keynote speakers there that really set this morning's agenda, and some really core themes coming through, constantly coming back to the importance of putting the young person right at the centre of everything and thinking about our contribution to that young person's pro-social identity. We're going to move.